The wind moved across the broken city like a whisper from a world that no longer existed. Shattered walls stood like bones of giants, and the air still carried the smoke of battles that had ended months ago. Daniel walked carefully down a cracked street with his rifle across his chest and his helmet heavy on his head. He had been stationed in this part of the frontier for 6 weeks, and every day looked the same. Ruins upon ruins, silence broken only by the sound of distant machines still moving without masters. He did not expect to find anything alive here, not human, not alien, not anything that belonged to the world before. But that day something unusual caught his attention. At first he thought it was only a shape among the ruins, some cloth moving in the wind, but as he drew closer he saw her clearly. She was sitting on the broken steps of what must once have been a temple or a courthouse. Her head was bowed, her long hair like silver falling over her face, and her hands rested in her lap as though she had been waiting for someone for a very long time. She was not human, that much Daniel saw at once, but she was not like the terrifying images of alien warriors shown in briefing files. Her features were soft, her skin held a faint glow of pale violet under the sunlight, and her eyes when she looked up at him were deep and filled with sorrow. Daniel raised his rifle by instinct, but did not fire. She made no move to attack or even to flee. She simply lifted her head and looked at him as though he was the one she had been waiting for. There was something strange in that gaze, something that pressed against the cold wall he had built inside himself through all the months of war. She rose slowly to her feet, her body tall and graceful, though her clothing was torn and marked by dust. She looked like someone who had carried grief for so long that it had become part of her skin. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but steady. She asked him in clear words if he was a soldier of the humans. Daniel gave a short nod, not sure yet if it was wise to speak. She took one step closer, her eyes never leaving his, and then she said something he could never have expected. She asked him to take her home as his wife. The word struck him harder than any bullet. For a moment he thought he had not heard her correctly. He lowered his rifle slightly and told her he did not understand. She repeated it, her voice trembling only a little this time. She said she was a widow, that her husband had died during the war when their city was destroyed, and that now she was alone. In her people's custom, a widow left without family was considered without value, a burden, or even a curse, and many would treat her as less than human. She said she had survived because she hid among the ruins, but she could not live like that forever. She looked at him with those sorrowful eyes and asked again if he would take her, not out of desire, but out of mercy and honor. Daniel felt a weight on his chest that he had not felt in years. He was a soldier, trained to see aliens as the enemy, trained to follow orders without question, but standing in front of him was not an enemy. It was a woman, broken yet unyielding, who asked not for pity but for protection and belonging. He did not answer her right away. His thoughts ran in circles. If his unit found out he was speaking with her, let alone taking her anywhere, it would mean punishment, maybe even prison. And yet he could not bring himself to walk away. The silence stretched between them until she lowered her head again. She told him that if he refused, she would not beg a second time. She said she only asked because when she saw him walking she felt a spark of hope, and hope was something she had not felt since her husband died. Daniel swallowed hard. He thought of his own life, of the emptiness he carried inside, of the faces of comrades lost, and the endless battles that seemed to strip away what made him human. He wondered if this meeting was chance or if fate had placed her here for a reason. Finally, he asked her name. She answered softly, saying her name was Lyra. The way she spoke it carried a tone of music even in the ruins of war. He repeated it under his breath as though testing it, and then he lowered his rifle completely. He told her he could not promise anything yet, that he needed time to think, but he would not leave her alone in this place. She gave him a faint smile, the first sign of warmth on her face, and it was enough to make him feel he had already stepped onto a path he could no longer turn from. Daniel looked around the street, alert again, for danger could come at any moment. He told her to follow him and keep close. As they moved through the ruins together, he felt the strangeness of it all. A human soldier and an alien widow walking side by side. He felt uneasy, but also oddly calmer than he had in months. He wondered what his fellow soldiers would say if they saw him now, but he pushed the thought away. For now there was only the sound of their steps, and the silent agreement that something had begun between them. Night fell before they reached the outpost. Daniel found a sheltered corner inside a half-collapsed building, and they stayed there until morning. He sat awake most of the night, watching her as she slept curled against the cold wall. She looked fragile yet unbroken, someone who had lost everything yet still held enough courage to ask a stranger for a future. He realized then that she had not only asked for a place in his life, she had forced him to confront what kind of man he was. The question would not leave him as dawn came over the ruined city. Was he a soldier who followed orders blindly, or was he still human enough to choose compassion over command? When the first light touched the horizon, he knew that whatever path lay ahead, he could not turn his back on her now. The morning sun spread a pale glow over the broken horizon as Daniel led Lyra through the silent streets. The ruins seemed endless, but he had walked them so often that he knew where the safest paths lay. She followed close behind, her movements graceful even though her clothes were worn and her face carried the weight of grief. Daniel glanced back at her from time to time, still uncertain why he was doing this, still hearing her words from yesterday echoing in his mind. She had asked him to take her home as his wife, words that carried a meaning far larger than a simple request. As they moved, Daniel thought of the rules of his command. Soldiers were warned not to make personal ties with locals, especially with those from alien races who were considered unpredictable. Breaking this rule meant trouble, and trouble in wartime often ended a career before it began. Yet the memory of her eyes when she had spoken, the way her voice trembled but never lost its dignity, kept him from leaving her behind. Something inside him refused to see her as a stranger. When they reached a safer part of the ruins, Daniel stopped and told her to rest. She sat on a stone ledge while he stood watch, scanning the empty streets with his rifle ready. After a while, she spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear, carried by the wind between the broken walls. She said she wanted him to understand why she had spoken to him as she did. She explained that among her people, a widow who lost her husband in war was considered vulnerable and often unwanted. Families turned away widows, clans refused to take them in, and without protection, they were easy prey for raiders or desperate men. Some were sold, others simply vanished. Her husband had died defending their city, and with his death her future had been torn away. She lifted her eyes to him then, and the sadness in them struck him harder than any weapon. She told him she did not ask because of love or desire, but because she believed he was a man of honor. She said when she saw him walking down the ruined street, he carried himself not like a conqueror, but like someone weary of war, and that gave her hope. She said she could not survive much longer alone, and if he refused her, she would accept it. But she had to ask because this was her last chance. Daniel felt a heavy silence settle between them. He shifted uncomfortably, torn between duty and something deeper that stirred inside him. He told her he was just a soldier, that his life was full of rules and orders, and taking her with him could destroy everything he had worked for. But even as he said the words, he knew they lacked strength. He knew he would remember her voice long after he returned to his outpost, and the thought of her wandering these ruins alone made him restless. Lyra lowered her gaze and nodded slowly as if she had expected his answer. She said she understood, and that she did not wish to bring him harm. She said she would not ask again. Then she turned her face away, and the sight of her shoulders shaking with silent grief cut through the last of his hesitation. Daniel realized in that moment that rules and duty meant little if they required him to abandon someone who had nothing left. He crouched down in front of her so she would see his eyes. He told her he could not promise her a safe life or even a peaceful one, but he would not leave her to die in the ruins. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, tears welled in her eyes and rolled silently down her face. She whispered thank you, and though the words were small, they carried more weight than any medal he had ever received. The rest of the day they moved carefully together, hiding from the shadows of broken towers and crossing streets only when the way was clear. Several times Daniel thought he saw movement in the distance, other survivors perhaps, or scavengers, and each time he felt the tension rise. Lyra kept close, her presence strangely calming even as danger pressed around them. At one point she stumbled on a piece of rubble, and when he reached to steady her, she gripped his arm tightly, her touch light yet filled with silent trust. By the time the sun began to set, Daniel knew his unit would soon notice his absence. He thought of the questions they might ask, the suspicion that would follow if he returned with her at his side. Yet when he looked at her walking beside him, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes still holding a faint spark, he knew he could not turn back now. She had placed her hope in him, and though he had not asked for it, he felt responsible for carrying it. That night they found shelter inside the shell of a burned-out vehicle bay. Daniel lit a small lamp and gave her a ration pack. She ate slowly, as though each bite carried memories of meals long gone. After a while she began to speak again, telling him about her life before the war. She told him of her husband, a kind man who had believed the war would end quickly. She told him of the home they had built together, a house on the edge of the city with a garden where flowers once grew. Her voice grew softer when she spoke of the night the city fell, the fire that consumed everything, and the moment she saw her husband fall in battle. Daniel listened without interrupting, his chest heavy with the weight of her story. He had heard many tales of loss during the war, but hearing it here, face to face, made it different. She was not just another casualty in a report. She was a living soul carrying a wound deeper than any physical scar. When she finished, she looked at him and asked again if he truly meant what he had said earlier, that he would not leave her behind. Daniel met her gaze and answered firmly that he would not. She nodded, and for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. It was a small smile, fragile like glass, but it lit the dark space around them more than the lamp dot as he sat awake. That night, guarding their shelter, Daniel thought of the path ahead. He had made a choice whether he admitted it aloud or not. His orders would never allow it, his officers would never approve. But something had changed. He no longer saw her as an alien widow asking for shelter. He saw her as someone who had given him a reason to feel again. And though he did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, he knew he would walk it beside her. The morning came cold and gray. Daniel woke first, his eyes scanning the empty street outside their shelter. He could hear the faint sound of broken metal shifting in the wind, and far away the low hum of machines still roaming without masters. The war had ended, but the land was not safe. Patrol drones and raider bands still searched the ruins, scavenging whatever they could. He tightened the strap of his rifle and looked back at Lyra. She was still sleeping, her head resting lightly against the wall, her silver hair spread across her shoulder. For a moment he allowed himself to simply watch her, and he felt something stir in him that he had thought long buried. Then he shook himself back to focus. He told her they had to move before soldiers from his unit noticed his absence. She rose quickly, quiet and obedient, though her eyes still showed the tiredness of sleepless nights. They moved out together into the empty streets. Daniel kept his pace steady but careful, always alert to sounds around them. Lyra walked close, never falling behind, and though she said little, he could sense her trust in him with every step she took. As they moved deeper into the city, they passed burned vehicles and collapsed towers. The smell of smoke still lingered even after months. Daniel kept his mind sharp, but part of him could not ignore the weight of her presence beside him. It felt strange to have someone depending on him, not as a soldier, but as a man. He had carried comrades out of battle. He had fought to protect civilians before, but this was different. This was personal, and the responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, yet also gave him a strange sense of purpose. Midday sun fell harsh across the rubble. When they heard the first signs of trouble, voices echoed faintly, harsh and guttural, followed by the sound of boots against stone. Daniel pulled Lyra into the shadow of a broken wall and signaled for silence. A group of raiders appeared at the far end of the street, armed with scavenged rifles and blades. Their eyes searched the ruins like predators. Daniel knew what would happen if they saw her. He felt her hand grip his sleeve tightly, her breath quick against his arm, and he whispered that she should not move. The raiders passed without noticing them, their laughter echoing through the street, cruel and empty. When the sound faded, Daniel waited a long moment before leading Lyra away. Her hand lingered on his arm, trembling slightly, and he realized how close they had come to disaster. She whispered her thanks, her voice soft as a breeze. He only nodded, unwilling to show the fear he still felt inside. Later that evening, they reached the outskirts of the city where broken roads led to the open plains beyond. Here the ruins thinned out and the sky stretched wide, painted with the fading light of dusk. Daniel knew the journey would become harder now. Out in the open, there would be less cover, more risk of being seen by patrols or machines still active. But it was the only way to reach the human outpost where he hoped to find safety for her. That night they made camp inside the shell of an overturned transport. Daniel shared what little food he had left and gave her his jacket to keep warm. The air grew colder, and when she shivered, he moved closer, not thinking of rules or appearances, but only of keeping her alive. She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the faint firelight, and she told him something that caught him off guard. She said she was not afraid of dying anymore, because she had already lost everything, but she was afraid of being forgotten. Her voice shook when she said she did not want to vanish like so many others, without a name or a memory left behind. Daniel sat in silence, her words digging deep into him. He told her that as long as he lived, she would not be forgotten. He said her name aloud, Lyra, letting it carry through the dark night, and he promised that he would remember it, no matter what came. For a moment her eyes filled with tears again, but this time she smiled through them. She whispered that maybe fate had led her to him, and Daniel did not argue. The next day brought new dangers. As they crossed the plains, they encountered a scouting drone hovering low, its sensors glowing red as it scanned the ground. Daniel pushed Lyra into a ditch and covered her with his own body as the machine passed overhead. The noise of its engines thundered in his ears, but it did not see them. When it finally disappeared into the distance, Lyra clutched his arm tightly. She whispered that he had risked himself for her without hesitation, and he answered that it was not a risk but a choice. The journey wore on. They traveled by day and hid by night, always watching the skies for drones and the horizon for raiders. Each step grew heavier, but at the same time Daniel noticed how strong Lyra was becoming. She no longer walked with the weakness of grief, but with the determination of someone who had chosen to live. She shared small stories of her people, their songs and festivals, their gardens and markets, and though her voice sometimes trembled with loss, it also carried hope. Daniel found himself telling her stories as well. He spoke of his childhood back on Earth, of wide green fields and rivers that sparkled under the sun. He told her of his mother's cooking and the laughter of his younger brother. He had not spoken of these things in years, but with her it came easily. She listened with quiet attention, her eyes soft, and when he finished, she said it sounded like a world worth living for. Her words warmed him more than the fire they shared at night. As days passed, Daniel began to see the bond forming between them. It was not just soldier and refugee, not just protector and protected. It was something deeper, unspoken, yet undeniable. He knew it was dangerous to think this way, dangerous to let it grow, but he could not stop it. Each time she smiled at him, each time she placed her trust in him without hesitation, he felt the walls inside him breaking. By the time they saw the faint outline of the human outpost on the horizon, Daniel understood that his choice had already been made. He had taken her into his care, and no order or law could make him turn away now. But he also knew the hardest part was still ahead. His fellow soldiers would not understand, his commanders would not approve, and the risk of losing everything he had built was very real. Yet as he looked at Lyra walking beside him, her face lit by the setting sun, he knew he would face whatever came. For the first time in years, Daniel felt he was walking not just toward survival, but toward something worth living for. The outpost rose like a jagged shadow on the horizon, a fortress of steel and concrete standing among the barren plains. Daniel felt his steps grow heavier as they drew closer because he knew what awaited him inside those walls. His unit would see the alien woman walking beside him. They would ask questions, and his answers would not satisfy them. He had rehearsed excuses in his head, lies he could tell, but none of them felt right. He was not a liar, and he was not ashamed of her, yet he understood the laws of the army and how coldly they were enforced. Lyra sensed his unease as they approached. She slowed her pace and finally stopped, her eyes fixed on the tall gates of the outpost. She asked him in a quiet voice if he was certain this was what he wanted. Daniel turned to her, and for the first time since they met, he saw fear in her face, not of raiders or drones, but of him leaving her behind. She told him she would not blame him if he changed his mind now. She said she could disappear into the wilds and survive as best she could, but she did not want to be the reason he lost his place among his own people. Daniel stood still, staring at the gates in the distance. He thought of his years of service, the medals, the brothers he had lost, the weight of duty drilled into him since he was young. Then he looked at her, at the woman who had walked beside him through ruins and danger, who had placed her life in his hands without hesitation. He remembered her words about not wanting to be forgotten, about hope being the only thing left to her. His chest tightened, and he knew the truth. He could not let her go now, not when she had already become part of him. They reached the gates, just as the sun began to fall. Guards stationed above shouted down at Daniel, asking where he had been and who the woman was. Their voices carried suspicion and hostility. Daniel raised his hand and called back that she was under his protection, but his words only made them more uneasy. Within minutes, his commanding officer arrived, a stern man with cold eyes and a voice like steel. He demanded to know why a human soldier had returned with an alien at his side. Daniel explained that she was not a threat, that she was a widow with no one left, that she only sought shelter. His officer cut him off, saying rules were rules and no alien was to be brought into human camps without clearance. The officer looked at Lyra with contempt, as though she was an enemy still, even though the war was over. He ordered Daniel to hand her over to patrols who would escort her away. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle. Lyra stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She told the officer she had asked Daniel to take her as his wife, that it was not pity but a bond she sought, a vow she wished to make. The officer laughed harshly, dismissing her words as nonsense. He turned back to Daniel and gave him a final command. Leave her or face charges of betrayal. The world seemed to hold its breath in that moment. Daniel stood frozen, the weight of choice pressing down on him. Around him, soldiers watched with cold curiosity, waiting to see if he would obey or defy. He felt Lyra's presence beside him, silent but unwavering. He heard her whisper softly that she would leave if it meant saving him, that she would not let him throw away his life for her. But those words only struck deeper, for he realized she still did not understand how much she had already given him. Daniel raised his head and looked straight into the eyes of his commanding officer. He said clearly that he would not abandon her. He said that if protecting her meant breaking rules, then he would break them. His voice carried across the courtyard, strong and certain. Murmurs rippled among the soldiers, shock at his defiance. But Daniel stood firm. The officer's face darkened with anger. He ordered guards to seize Lyra, but Daniel stepped between them. His rifle was not aimed, yet the way he held it left no doubt he would fight if forced. The guards hesitated, unwilling to spill blood among their own for what seemed like a personal matter. Tension crackled like lightning in the air. Lyra placed a hand on Daniel's arm then, her touch gentle but steady. She whispered that she did not want violence, that if his own people turned on him because of her, then she would leave. But Daniel shook his head. He said he had fought too many battles that left him empty, and this was the first one that gave his life meaning. He told her she was not a burden, not a weakness, but the reason he still felt human at all. The officer gave one last warning, his voice filled with fury, but Daniel ignored it. Instead, he lifted his rifle high into the air and placed it on the ground at his feet. He declared that he would not fight his own men, but he would not surrender her either. He said if they wished to strip him of rank and duty, they could, but they would not strip him of his choice. Silence fell over the outpost. The soldiers looked at one another, uncertain. The officer finally spat out an order to confine Daniel, but even then no one moved. Perhaps they had seen enough of war. Perhaps they were tired of rules that crushed compassion. Some looked at Lyra with new eyes, not as an enemy but as a woman who had survived. The moment stretched long until at last the officer turned sharply and stormed away, leaving the matter unsettled but no longer enforced. That night Daniel sat with Lyra in a small storage room where they had been placed under watch. She looked at him with eyes wide from all that had happened. She asked him why he had risked everything for her when he could have walked away. He answered simply that walking away would have meant losing more than his rank. It would have meant losing himself. She reached for his hand then, her fingers entwining with his, and for the first time there was no barrier between them. The choice had been made. Whatever came next, Daniel knew he would not regret it. The night in the outpost was heavy with silence. Daniel sat on the cold floor of the storage room while Lyra rested beside him, her head leaning against his shoulder. Guards had been placed outside the door, not to harm them, but to make sure they did not leave. The tension of the day still burned in Daniel's chest. He had defied his officer, he had broken the rules, and though punishment would surely come, he felt no regret. Lyra was beside him, and that was enough. When dawn arrived, the door creaked open. A different officer stood there, older and calmer, a man who had seen many wars and perhaps grown tired of them. He looked at Daniel with steady eyes and asked him to step outside. Lyra rose too, unwilling to let him go alone, and together they walked into the open courtyard. Soldiers gathered around, curious to see what would happen. The officer cleared his throat and said the command had made its decision. Daniel would be stripped of his post and sent back to Earth for reassignment. As for the alien woman, she could not remain in the outpost without official clearance. The order was clear. She would be transported to a refugee station, outside the sector where her fate would be decided by others. The words fell like stones, heavy and cold. But before Daniel could speak, the officer raised his hand and added quietly that he did not agree with the decision. He said war was over, and yet fear still ruled hearts, and that was not how peace was built. His voice carried not just authority, but weariness, and some of the soldiers shifted uneasily as they listened. Daniel turned to Lyra. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She whispered that she would go if it meant he could return home in safety. She said she would not let him throw away his life for her, not after all he had already risked. But Daniel shook his head firmly. He had made his choice before, and nothing had changed. He told the officer that she was not his burden, not a refugee to be passed around, but his partner. He said he had already vowed to protect her, and he would not step away from that vow. His voice rang clear across the courtyard, and for a long moment no one spoke. Finally the officer sighed deeply. He said he could not rewrite orders, but he could look the other way. He told Daniel that if he left quietly with her before the next patrol shift, there would be no report, no trial, no punishment. It would be as though he had vanished from service, a soldier lost among the countless missing. The officer warned that such a choice would mean exile, no return to Earth, no honor left in uniform. But if Daniel truly believed in what he said, then this was his only chance. Daniel met Lyra's gaze. She was trembling, torn between relief and fear, but her eyes glowed with a light he had never seen before. She whispered that she would go wherever he went, whether it was Earth or exile, whether it was peace or struggle. Daniel felt his chest tighten, and he nodded once, a simple gesture that sealed his future. With the help of the older officer, they slipped out of the outpost before sunrise. No alarm was raised, no voices shouted after them. They crossed the plains under a sky turning gold with morning light. Ahead lay a transport ship abandoned by war, but still functional, hidden in a canyon where smugglers once gathered. The officer had told them of it, saying it was their best chance of leaving the planet unnoticed. Inside the ship, the controls flickered weakly but came alive under Daniel's hands. He had trained on transport systems before, and his memory guided him through the sequence. Lyra sat beside him, her eyes wide as the engines rumbled to life. Dust swirled outside the windows as the ship lifted slowly from the ground. The planet that had been nothing but ruins and sorrow fell away beneath them, and for the first time since the war, Daniel felt the weight of chains breaking. As they entered the silence of space, Daniel looked at her. She sat quietly, her hands folded, but when she turned to him, her face softened with a smile. It was not the fragile smile of gratitude he had seen before, but a smile of belonging, of a woman who had found a place again. He realized then that he had not only saved her from despair, she had saved him from becoming another soldier who lived only for orders. She had given him back his humanity. Days passed as they traveled, the stars endless around them. Daniel set a course for a colony on the edge of human space, a place where soldiers rarely went and rules were softer. Along the way he and Lyra spoke of the future. She told him she wished to plant a garden again, to see life grow in soil instead of ruins. He told her he wished to live quietly, away from war, to wake each morning with peace instead of gunfire. They shared dreams like fragile seeds, and each word made them stronger. On the 7th day, the colony came into view, a cluster of lights on a green world, untouched by battle. They landed quietly, no questions asked, no uniforms demanding answers. People there welcomed newcomers without judgment, and for the first time Daniel felt they had found a true home. Together they built a small house on the edge of the settlement, simple but warm. Lyra planted flowers outside, their colors bright against the soil, and Daniel worked the fields with other settlers. At night, they sat together under the stars, speaking of the past not with sorrow but with gratitude, for the past had brought them to each other. Lyra often whispered that she had never thought she would live to see peace again, and Daniel would answer that peace was not given, it was chosen, and they had chosen it together. Months passed and the scars of war slowly faded. Daniel no longer wore his uniform, no longer carried the weight of command. Instead he carried the memory of a choice that had changed his life. He had given up a career, but he had gained something greater. Lyra was no longer a widow left alone. In ruins, she was his partner, his family, the heart of a new beginning. And so their story ended not in battle but in quiet strength. Two lives once broken, now woven together. The galaxy would forget many names, as it always did after war, but Daniel knew one thing with certainty. Lyra would never be forgotten, not by him, and in her eyes he knew she felt the same. The war was over, and at last so was their wandering, the end.